Hello and welcome to My Finance Teacher. By popular request, let's have a look at copper in this video. You know that we do like to look at cycles, and looking at copper cycles over the last nearly a decade, at least since the middle of 2018, copper likes to follow these cycles that last on average for just over 4.5 months, 134 days on average. The ongoing cycle is already 95 days long, so if this cycle does turn out to be pretty close to the average duration, we've already passed the typical midpoint of the cycle, and maybe some caution might be advised going into the future. However, looking at the last couple of cycles, they were rather short. The average between the last two was 106 days only, and usually long cycles or a couple of long cycles are followed by short cycles, and vice versa. A couple of short cycles might be followed by a longer cycle, just to bring that average duration back towards that typical one. So a couple of scenarios for the ongoing cycle is that, especially if the general stock market continues to defy gravity, copper can continue pushing higher for quite a while, several weeks, perhaps 2 to 3 months over here. But I don't see this as the most likely scenario. A more likely scenario for me is perhaps copper continues a little higher to retest the recent highs, perhaps come close to around $5.50 as the general stock market continues pushing a little bit higher. And after that, I would really be cautious with copper going down into its typical cycle low. After all, while yes, Bollinger Bands aren't really very wide, but we have already seen a repeated poke above those Bollinger Bands, and yes, they're not really wide yet, so copper can still continue a little bit higher before a turnaround in momentum. As I've often mentioned in a lot of my previous videos, a repeated poke above relatively wide Bollinger Bands suggests that a bit of cool down is likely going into the near future. Another thing that suggests some caution here, purely on the technicals, is this negative divergence on RSI. A negative divergence is a situation where price prints a higher high while RSI prints a lower high. That also precedes a bit of a cool down in momentum. But of course, we might still see copper push a third time into this sort of a ceiling of $5.4, $5.5 before a likely decline down into its cycle low. Next, it's important to have a look at market sentiment. When everyone is excited about a particular asset, when your typical taxi driver has started noticing that gold, copper, or whatever is this particular asset has become rather expensive, that's when the market is overheated, the sentiment is excessively optimistic, and that's when some caution is advised. Specifically on copper, this optics, the optimism index, whenever it comes pretty close to the level of 70, or especially when it breaks above the level of 70, that's when we're likely pretty close to that particular copper cycle top. Of course, there are some exceptions historically, as in, let's say, 2021, when copper continued pushing higher for a couple of years out of that pandemic low. In those situations, in a prolonged push higher, yes, market optics can reach even higher than the level of 90. The peak we've seen in early 2021 was at a 91. But generally, coming close to this level of 70 suggests some caution. And yes, we are not there yet, but we have seen copper already break into high 60s. Again, as I mentioned, maybe another push higher over the next couple of weeks before an eventual decline down into the cycle low. When is it going to happen? Nobody knows the future, but that is likely to take place over the next couple of months, maybe 3 months. Another very interesting metric to look at is commitment of traders, and within those traders we usually look at this difference in behavior of commercials, which are generally considered the smart money. The position of commercials over here is a red line at the bottom of the chart, versus the position of the speculators, the green line, who are often called the dumb money, but sometimes it's the smart money that is losing out looking at the price chart. As in, let's say again that late 2020, early 2021, as copper was jumping out of the pandemic lows, in those situations, yes, Sometimes this negative position in the commercials is quite a bit ahead of the eventual top. But again, as I mentioned, those situations are not extremely common. Generally, looking at the position of the commercials, again the red line, the larger their negative position is, the more likely we are approaching some sort of a cycle top. And over the last several months, we haven't really observed much change in the position of the commercials. But it has stayed quite well into the negative level over the last several months. So again, while copper can push higher with commercials increasing the size of their negative positions, eventually, while perhaps not right now, but maybe over the next couple of weeks, one would really be advised to be somewhat cautious. Especially looking at the producers themselves rather than actual copper itself. And generally we do observe trends developing over the years on this chart. For example, for several years before the pandemic low, we've observed this trend that's on the left part of your screen right now. And whenever this ratio was approaching this red line, producers were getting somewhat expensive versus the copper price itself. And near the green line, producers were rather cheap and were bound to catch up with relatively expensive copper itself. After the pandemic, until basically this year, we've observed a slightly different channel, and over the last year or so, looks like we have another structural break over here. We'll have to see what sort of a channel develops after this break. But in either case, at the moment, it doesn't really seem that producers are very cheap. Usually this suggests, again, some sort of a froth in the market, and maybe some sort of caution is advised going into the future. Especially if the general stock market, this is S&P 500 in front of you, decides to finally cool down towards its intermediate cycle low. After all, the ongoing intermediate cycle has already been going on for 208 days. This is quite a bit of a stretch. Usually these cycles last for around half a year. And of course, if stock market corrects, copper is likely to follow as well. Again, perhaps not in the very short term, but somewhere in the midterm of the next several months. That's all from me, but of course this is simply an opinion that I share. Nobody does know the future. Hence, I am curious what you think. Which is going to happen sooner on copper? $5 or $6? Let me know what you think down in the comments below. Have a marvelous Monday. Bye bye.